Hello, and welcome everyone to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the Executive Director of New Hampshire Peace Action. And if you are new to NHPA, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work. And we found it so effective that we've decided to continue it on indefinitely. This bi-weekly online conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes that we've all been yearning for and fighting for. In the spirit of understanding and respect, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they've been stewarding throughout the generations. So tonight we are joined by Olivia Zink, who has been a friend and comrade in struggle for a long time, at least the last 14 years. She has been running Open Democracy, which is the state's leading group that works on money and politics and keeping our electoral process fair and open. I have always had a huge admiration for Olivia because she is, in my opinion, one of the best strategic campaign designers and implementation people in the country. I have always admired her. And when I've had real organizing challenges, sometimes my mentor Arnie Alpert has looked at me when I've said, "How do I do this?" And he'd say, "What would Olivia Zink do?" And so Olivia is going to talk to us tonight about the work that she does and how it links to militarism. Olivia, welcome, and thank you so much for giving us some of your time tonight.
Oh, thank you, Will, and thank you for that introduction. For those that are not familiar, Open Democracy is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works on money and politics, voting rights, and fair districts. And so tonight I'm going to lean in on some data and numbers. I have a few slides to share, and then I will stop screen sharing so that we can have a conversation about this. And if my screen would slideshow. Is everyone able to see the screen okay?
Sure can.
Okay. So I really want to talk about democracy reform strategies, advocacy strategies that are needed to move the conversation forward on money and politics and militarization. But you're going to hear a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics that might make you feel a little depressed or sad. I really want you to know that hope is needed to fix our democracy. So I really want to ground us all. And there's a lot of data and a lot of analysis that we're about to embark on in this conversation. But what we need most is hope that we can correct and fix some of these big problems that our country has. So if you had $1 million, would you use it to buy a politician? You can raise your hand or type in the chat. Would you use your $1 million to buy a politician? Tell me yes or no, and you can elaborate on why. So I see people shaking their heads. So if you had $1 million, would you use it to buy a politician? No, people are saying no. As we have seen the explosive growth of how much money is in our elections, we really have to raise questions about the role of money in politics and the degree that money influences our election. As it pertains to this conversation, the military-industrial complex has a 450,000% return on investment. And so these numbers are for
We're still seeing a loading screen on your PowerPoint for some reason.
I'm going to stop share and try it again. Hold on one second. We tested this beforehand. Sorry that it. Doreen, Doreen, are you able to screen share your screen with my slides since my internet's being funky?
Find them. I don't have the latest ones that Arnie.
Yeah, hold on. Can you see my
There you go.
screen now?
You can see that. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
It's gone weird again.
It's gone weird again.
For me, someone else. Will, can you see?
Yeah, no, I'm seeing a white screen with a black rectangle on the left.
Okay. That is bizarre. Doreen, it should be the same link. Okay. Well, I'm just going to talk through the slides and
Olivia, we could see it before you put it in slideshow mode. We just saw the thing on the left, so that might actually be better. You might want to try that.
Do it not. Thank you, Arnie. Okay. One more time here. Then you're going to see the slides that are coming up.
Oh, there it is. There it is. I see something.
Okay. So if you had $1 million, would you buy a politician? Was my question to you all. Some of you may have answered that I saw a big thumbs down, right? No, I would not spend $1 million to buy a politician. We have seen an explosive growth in the cost of elections. And as it relates to the question of tonight on the military industrial complex, we see a return on investment that these companies have. So the military industrial complex gave $10 million to the Congressional Defense Committee and received $45 billion in spending increase. So they spent $10 million and they received $45 billion. There's a link to that report. If anyone wants to read the whole 45-page report. I want to talked about open secrets in the last election cycle. Analysis shows that 45 senators secured earmarks to the defense sector. You saw $1.8 billion of military construction earmarks in a budget bill passed in December, a record-setting $850 billion defense spending authorization. We also saw that these earmarks were in 32 states, and the defense industry has been very good about spreading jobs throughout the country to get funding for all of communities. So remember, they spent $10 million and received $45 billion in return for a return on investment. And they did that through purchasing heavily, making campaign contributions to 45 senators. You'll see there's pretty even balance between Republican and Democratic senators in the spending that they did through the open secrets analysis of the military contracts earmarks. You also have the breakdown spending per senator. So Chuck Schumer was the #1 getter. And you can see the Republican and Democratic senators that received the larger chunk of defense sector contributions in the 2022 election cycle. It's a lot of money, folks. It's a lot of money. Some of the actors that are spending money to influence our government, the Pentagon, 25% of Pentagon contracts has gone to 5 companies Those 5 companies are listed here on the slides. These 5 companies received about $286 billion of contracts in fiscal year 19 and 20 alone. And, you know, in the last 20 years have received over $2 trillion of money, these 5 companies. The 5 actors that I referred to on the last slide, I have the 2018 numbers, so it is a couple of election cycles old, how much they spent to try to influence our government. So, you know, the first one is 4 million, the next company is 3.8 million, $3.5 million, 2.8, and then Raytheon and United Technologies have now merged. So, but in 2008 they were separate companies. So we know how much money is spent in our election because of some of the disclosure that we have. We can have better federal disclosure laws. There is a Disclose Act being debated in Congress, and there are other solutions to get money out of politics, like public funding of elections or democracy dollars, as I like to call them. But we also need to work on our local campaign finance disclosure. New Hampshire gets an F in the country. And tomorrow morning, there's a piece of legislation, House Bill 195, that would increase disclosure and transparency of campaign money in New Hampshire. So if you are able to log on to Gen Court, and Senate election law is hearing a bill at 9:45 tomorrow, that would strengthen our disclosure score. You know, get New Hampshire currently ranks 48 out of 50 states in having campaign disclosure at the state level. And we talk a lot about the money at the federal level at the beginning of this presentation, but we do see that influence at the state level. I really want to talk about the price we pay as taxpayers. The average taxpayer pays about $929 to pay for the price tag of the corporate military contracts. So this is your chunk of money. This is your $1,000 that, you know, or $929 that you pay. And so think about what you would rather do with $929 of your taxpayers if it wasn't going to these things. We can't have this conversation without talking about how much lobbying happens in Washington, D.C., but also at every state capital across the country. So weapons makers have spent $2.5 billion lobbying over the last decade, employing about 700 lobbyists. And that's about 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress. So there's more lobbyists for the military industrial complex than there are members of Congress. Arnie's on the call, and I added this in just for Arnie. So I'm just going to ask Arnie to speak a little bit to this slide.
This actually comes out of an article that was in the New York Times just a couple weeks ago. And just to say that there's a narrative that's going around right now that the Pentagon is running out of certain weapons, out of munitions. And there's a couple reasons for it. They're claiming it's because we're giving all these weapons to Ukraine. They're claiming that the defense industrial base has been weakened due to mergers, which were encouraged because we were supposed to be getting a peace dividend after we were withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the military was supposed to be getting smaller, and that they encouraged the companies to merge with each other, and now we don't have enough capacity to make weapons. So anyway, I want you to, for one thing, to watch out for that, because you're going to hear that in the news, because it's generally accepted right now on Capitol Hill, and as accepted wisdom, you'll hear news reporters and such repeating that. But one of the things that was interesting, buried in this New York Times story, is it says that one of the reasons why these weapons, this munitions, the lower level stuff are running short, supposedly, is because the lobbyists before the Lockheeds and the Raytheons and the General Dynamicses have been steering the government toward buying the big ticket items, ships, planes, missiles, and stuff that cost a whole lot more money and which generates higher profits for those companies. And it was right there in black and white in the New York Times. The government has mostly focused on buying new ships, planes, and high-priced pieces of equipment where these contractors, the ones that Olivia was talking about, make most of their money.
Thanks, Arnie. I also want, I told you we all have to have hope that we can change the system, but I'm going to go further bad news before we get back to hopeful ideas. January 6th, you saw companies donating directly to the Sedition Caucus. You saw Boeing, you saw Lockheed Martin, GM donating to many of the candidates that were pushing some of the January 6th ideas. Some of them after January 6th pledged not to give any PAC money to any of those candidates. And then they gave money in the last election to some of these candidates. So they made a pledge publicly after January 6th, and then they reverted back on their pledge and gave money to 75 Republican objectors. So I want to say that to say some public statements are made and we need to really dig and do the research behind them to understand that our freedom to vote and our democracy is under attack right now. This is why we need to organize, right? We see another budget request for the Pentagon for $886.4 billion, a staggering $28 billion increase. I had a pen once that showed the Pentagon budget, and somebody might have one from when we were organizing at the asking presidential candidates. Will, what does that number say for the Pentagon budget?
So this pen is from, let's see, the number here is 646. The year, there was an overseas contingency fund, so it's Iraq and Afghanistan. 2007, and the number is 646. 646.
Okay, so these numbers, I feel like it was big when I used to talk about them in this pen, and it's only grown since we used to talk about this. And so when we handed out those pens many years ago, we told you have to talk to presidential candidates about how they can reduce the influence of money in politics and reduce the Pentagon spending. And well, guess what? We have another presidential primary coming up in New Hampshire, and candidates are coming. And we encourage you to organize and speak to them about reducing the influence of the military-industrial complex on and getting money out of politics so we can see some changes. We also need to understand the Pentagon's revolving door, and that in some research, 26 incidences of companies from the defense and national security sector from the Pentagon left and was part of defense contractors. So you see this revolving door at the Pentagon. So not always do they need to buy politicians, not always do they need to lobby for things. Sometimes they can just pay people to move over to their companies. I know we're going to talk a lot in the discussion, but I think everyone needs to call, write, and educate yourself, write letters to the editor, call your members of Congress. Many of you do this, but we really have to sort of get in a practice of democracy by practicing doing these things often and teaching others what to, how to do this, and sharing messages on what they should be saying when they call members of Congress, write letters to the editor, and how they can educate their community. Also, you can call your state senators about the disclosure bill that's being heard in the state Senate tomorrow, or share on social media. And with that, I want to open it up for questions and answers. And hopefully I didn't throw too many billions and millions and trillions of numbers at you, but there's a lot to unpack with all of this.
All right, folks, and you can feel free to either use the hand raise function in Zoom, or you can put an asterisk in the chat and I'm happy to call on you, or you can feel free to type your questions in the chat and I will read them aloud so that Olivia can respond. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, my question deals with something I've been studying, and that's the promotion of democracy overseas versus the democracy that we're trying to maintain here in America. And it seems like there are two different definitions of democracy. I mean, the democracy we promote overseas has to do with securing property rights and making sure that countries like Russia and China don't do things the way that the Western governments don't want them to. But when we talk about democracy at home, it's like it's a whole different definition. And so what I'm trying to figure out is how can we effectively maintain the democracy that we know at home, but also have the two terms, I don't know, not mean the same thing, but at least be able to speak of democracy as something that everyone can get on board with.
Thank you for that question. And there's a lot to unpack. And if others have ideas, please add to the conversation in the chat. But I do think that we have always strived to build a better democracy. 103 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote in this country. We've expanded rights. We expanded rights in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in order to expand the number of people who are able to participate in our democracy. But we still leave many people out for participating in our democracy. But we also see how much money and politics, how much lobbying affects our democracy. And until we reduce the influence of money in politics so that it's not $1, one vote, it's one person, one vote, and we all have equal voices. And there are solutions that can strengthen our democracy. I see Dan McMillan from Save Democracy in America on this call. Dan's promoting this idea of democracy dollars so that every voter is paying for towards that. But I also feel like there's so much to that question about democracy overseas. And Tom, can I just pick on you for your thoughts on sort of how this country can drive to answer that first part of the question?
Sure. I'm probably going to say some things that a lot of folks on this call are not going to agree with, but that'll make for a good conversation. I had the privilege for 8 years in the Obama administration of working as chief of staff to the Secretary of the Navy. And I will say, you know, and I can understand there are going to be some different points of view on this. I do think that much as I love the New York Times, they don't always get it right. And I will say that I think that what's happening in Ukraine is a demonstration of the fact that, you know, there are bad actors in the world. And one of the mistakes that I think those of us on the political left make is sort of seeing the Pentagon as a monolith the building is, but the services within it are really very different. The cultures of each of the services are very, very different. I had one foreign chief of Navy explain one time that the difference between soldiers and sailors was that soldiers look down, they look for obstacles, they look for boundaries, and that sailors look out to the horizon and see nothing but the horizon. And it really is true. And I think, you know, one of the things that I tried to do with colleagues at the State Department was to encourage them in places where the US is trying to reach out to countries that either have failing democracies or even worse, have military juntas who are controlling the government. Invariably, those military juntas are Army, not Navy. And that sailors typically tend to be more open-minded. They tend to, like people who grow up on the coasts, they interact with different people and they are much more tolerant, much more accepting of open people. I'll also say that one of the things the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps have done over the last 70 years is maintain freedom of the seas for trade. People may feel globalization is not a good thing, but there is no doubt that that prosperity globally has risen. It is unequal as it is in this country, but poverty levels have definitely lowered, and part of that is due to open sea lanes. And finally, I'll say that when there is a worldwide disaster, a hurricane or a tsunami or an earthquake, typically it is the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps who are the world's first responders, who get there and provide aid and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief are part of the mission of the Navy and the Marine Corps. Specifically, that's not true for the Army. That's not true for the Air Force. They do things differently. I lied. The last thing I'll say is one of the things that we found when we were at the Pentagon and tried to change to only a limited degree of success was at the time I was there, we were calculating that $1 out of every 5 spent on defense went to overhead, went to administration. It had nothing to do with making the world safer or the US safer. I'm sure that's worse now with the creation of yet another service, the Space Force, which I think is, to call it redundant is to be incredibly generous. All it did was create another level of bureaucracy, another group of flag officers with lieutenants and captains carrying their bags around behind them. It's just completely wasteful and is probably partly responsible for some of that increase. I know when I was there, I think the defense budget ranged between 700 and 750 billion. So it's grown quite a bit. Anyway, Olivia, I have no idea if I answered the question. I probably didn't, but that's the best I could do.
Well, I saw Amy Antonucci's hand up, so.
Yeah, we've got some questions in the chat too, but Amy's hand was the second one up. So Amy, go ahead.
It's okay. I was just trying to get the bill number to find the link, but Doreen already did it. So that was a while back. So I'll pass it on.
All right, I'll take one from the chat and then I'll go to Laura. Olivia, did you have something you wanted to add to that? Okay. So from the chat, I've got Chris Hansen. Yes. Where do Shaheen and Hassan, our reps, our 2 senators, rank in receiving funds from the military-industrial complex? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I just pulled up Open Secrets. And so this is Senator Shaheen's record and her top 20 influencers. So I am not seeing it rank above some of these other sectors, but there is a way to look at how much she gets from each company. So I can do that, Chris, and that research and send it to you, but it's also available on Open Secrets. And if anyone has those numbers off the top of their head, they can pop them into the chat. But we do have a senator who is on one of these ranking committees. And so I will say that I do think that there's probably some money flowing, but it's not in the top 20 of industries. Laura?
All right, Laura, go ahead.
We're talking about these billions of dollars going to the industrial complex. And I know most of you know that my husband passed away in November. And I've had such a problem with the federal government just getting things straightened out over a $500 bill that they're supposed to pay me once a month. So how come we're getting all the problems and they're getting all the money? I just don't get it.
Well,
Oh,
Laura, I just think, when we think about how do we have a government that works for all of us?
I
How
know.
do we as voters fund elections? How do we flip this on its head? And we're the ones giving small donor contributions to our government so that the government can start working for us instead of having a government that's working for those large campaign contributions and for the lobbyists. We need to change the game and unrig some of these broken systems, because you're right. Currently, things are not, like you're struggling to get your widower's benefit from Social Security, and it's a tragedy. But you don't have 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress right now working for you in Washington, D.C. Like
Yeah, my
these other industries.
Olivia, is I knew enough to pick up the phone and call Annie Custer's office and get them to move their butts. And I pushed them until it got fixed. I'm concerned that there's a lot of widows out there, now that I'm seeing it, that don't have that education to do all this stuff. And how do we get, the government to work for the people instead of against them? That's my big thing as far as money. And to see they're getting all this money to do what? Most of it's wasted on paperwork. They're not even, and they're not even transparent about it. What are they doing with all this money?
You're absolutely right. We need to increase transparency. Christine? Yeah, go ahead, Will. Do you want to add more to that?
I was going to say, Christine.
Hold on. Am I the last one here?
Yeah, we do have some questions in the chat, but you're up.
Okay, we'll go into another chat question. I'm going to make sure my husband has a handle on the dog so you don't have a bunch of barking in the background.
Sounds good.
I know there was a question in the chat. If I can say more,
I'll read it off. So we've got a bunch of questions about the. Oh, sorry, they're all about the bill actually. HB 195. All right. So
Arnie wanted me to say more. So
yeah, go ahead.
New Hampshire has, when you get those political ads in the mail, you see paid for by and different entities at the bottom. And really, the reason we get an F on our disclosure score in these national standings is because we don't have strong disclosure laws on who's paying for advertisements in our states. And there's a loophole in our disclosure law that we've been trying to fix for at least 10 years to encourage more transparency, so people who are spending money to influence the election would register and report. So House Bill 195 changes the definition of political advocacy organizations so that groups will need to register and report spending if they're spending more than $2,500 to influence New Hampshire's elections. So this helps at the state level to create more disclosure and transparency of who's spending money to influence New Hampshire's elections. That's being heard in Senate election law at 9:45 tomorrow, and Doreen has put a link for you to sign in support of 195 with remote testimony. And if anyone needs further instructions on how to sign in support, let us know and we'll walk you through how to do that, because collectively we all have to practice democracy and learn those skills. And happy to chat offline more about the specifics of New Hampshire's campaign finance laws and how we can strengthen them. But I see Michael has his hands up, so we'll take.
I think Representative Siebert is ready, and then
was ready.
go to
Sorry,
Matthew.
go back to Christine.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks, guys. Okay, so I just had one comment really to make, and I'm trying to place it even myself. but I sit on the the state federal Veterans Affairs Committee in the state house. And we had a lot of bills come through that were very like libertarian, really borderline, the same people who wanted to like secede from the government last time. And a few of them like actually sit on my committee, actually. And they're, they kind of have it seems like a lot of us that have been activists for a long time have, been upset with the military industrial complex and the money that runs through it. But they've kind of picked up in the same form or fashion in agreement. And you think it's all good, but then I have a hard time reconciling because they also want us to walk around with the same kind of weapons that a lot of these manufacturers make. And just have a militia. They're just like, let's get rid of the military and then have a militia running around. So I have a hard time just trying to figure out where we message it to where it works for everyone or something like that, I don't know if I explained that really well, and I can send you over more information on it, but seems to be the mentality they're taking with it. And I don't know if they're thinking it totally all the way through, but yeah. So.
Thank you for that. Arnie, I'm going to turn to Arnie to see if he has thoughts for you, Christine.
Thanks, Christine. I actually want to ask you about the chairman of your committee because he's my state rep, but that's for another time. I think that it's not an either or thing. It's not either we have the largest, military force in the world by a factor of a lot, or we have a bunch of fascist militias running around our state with AR-15s. I don't think those are the only options that are in front of us. So we should be able to actually enforce the state law, which bans independent militias, which doesn't seem to be happening. We could pass laws that restrict gun ownership and provide for gun safety. And we can also reduce the size of our military and reduce our tax burden at the same time.
No, I agree. I'd like to work with you in the future on some of that too.
Right.
Statewide.
And thank you for the work you do on state and federal relations committee, Christine. And I think it's interesting that you sort of show some of the dynamics that are happening to the political discourse in this country. And I think what you see in your committee is what we see in neighborhoods and in the Congress too. This sort of disconnect. And I think you're right that there might be ways that we need to sort of figure out how to work with people when we can find common ground, but also understand that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation that exists in different political ideologies right now. And the landscape is pretty hateful. And that's why I think hope is a solution, because we have to be hopeful that we can make changes and be to organize for that greater change.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Thank you so much.
And I see Kurt just popped in. Kurt, do you want to add on this conversation? I'm calling you out.
Where am I? I can't even see myself. But I don't know. I guess hanging around politicians a lot. I think that the main thing is tell the truth, and speak truth to power. And that's and do it in a very simple and straightforward and respectful way. And that could pretty much be about anything that you believe in. But, honest communication with these people, go to the State House, go to hearings you're interested in, talk to people one-on-one, and even do it at the highest levels in this state where we still have the ability to do that, whether we deserve it or not. So that's what I would say. Keep it simple. Talk about what you believe in. There's lots of ways that the topic we're talking about tonight impacts everyone you meet every day, whether they know it or not. And there are ways you can relate to this to their daily lives. And I would just say one thing would be the juxtaposition of healthcare in America and how we are funding a war overseas at the same time. These two crazy systems are happening at the same time. What kind of world is this? How do you feel about that? That's a good question, I think, for anyone. I'll leave it there. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. So Matthew, you've typed a couple in the chat, but you had your hand up. Do you want to ask those questions yourself?
Yeah, when the Pentagon budget grows, like I think it showed 28 billion for this year, is that coming directly at the expense of some other group, or is it just printed out of thin air?
Will, do you want to take that?
Well, sure. I mean, we don't have a balanced budget amendment, so the full federal budget is consistently more than the taxes have raised and has been for a while. When I've met with Senator Shaheen's aides and Senator Hassan's aides, they've used the term parity to defend why they support such huge increases to the Pentagon budget. They say if they're willing to increase the military side, that they can sometimes get Republicans to buy into increasing the social services side. So it's the reality is that we're spending more than the taxes are parity. I love that, Michael. So the reality is that like both yes and no. Like yes, this is money that's being spent on planes that don't fly and tanks that there are thousands of the same models in boneyards just sitting there fully functional, and all sorts of not just waste, but also stuff that makes violence and I think makes us less safe. But at the same time, that it is taking from a pot of money, and yes, that pot of money is artificially larger than we're able to raise in taxes. But so it's a yes and no. Like yes, it's in the same pot of money, but could you spend the same amount and put more to human needs? Sure. Could you spend less on both? Sure. More on both? Sure. Because they are able to, authorize expenses beyond what they have in tax revenues.
And then the follow-up question is, like say you compare the military to education, every single town has 5 schools, it's got libraries. So when you say 2 lobbyists per congressperson, if you stack that up against educators, you could have 100 educators per congressman, because I mean every town's got a bazillion educators. I mean, so I don't know, it just seems like the world of education could just blow away the lobbyists from the military just by sheer numbers.
What I was talking to is the registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So there are 700 plus registered lobbyists from the military industrial complex. I'm sure that the NEA and the teachers union and other educators have lobbyists registered at this in Congress. I don't know exactly how many they are, but the military industrial complex does have one of the largest amounts of paid lobbyists, people working full time in Washington to influence senators and representatives. You asked, are they more effective at getting money than other groups? And I would say no. I think you see fossil fuel lobbyists lobby for their interest. You see healthcare lobbying lobbyists for the like big pharma is effective at lobbying for big pharma's interest. So I don't know that the military industrial lobbyists are effective at getting more money than other interest groups, but I do think that we as voters, we as citizens, don't have the same voice that many of the lobbyists do with our politicians. And I think that's where we need to start to think about how do we change policies and procedures so that the government can work for us, that Laura's voice to get her Social Security check after her husband died is equal to the lobbyist for industry X or industry Y, because we need to start to think about policies that are benefiting the government as a whole. So democracy dollars is one solution that would give more voice and participation in campaigns to every citizens. But we certainly need additional lobbying reform so that so many industries don't have such a greater impact on our government.
So I'm going to read, go ahead. Someone trying to speak there?
I did. I was gonna say that he was talking about healthcare a minute ago, and I'm working with an organization that we're doing care over cost nationally. And what we're doing is finding people who have had their healthcare denied or their insurance payments denied. And we've been working with different patients across the country, and we're getting things overturned. And one patient had Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and last week they did a lobby type thing on Facebook where they got it out to all over the place, you know, that they won't treat this patient. She's going to die if she doesn't have a surgery. And Blue Cross is denying it. And Blue Cross ended up trending, and their stock went down that day. So there are ways of doing it. Like this next Friday coming up, we're going to be handling someone in New Hampshire using United Healthcare. So there are ways to, like I said, we knocked their stock down that day. It was, you know, but because there was so many people across the country doing it.
And Liz Tangerelli did some research on open secrets and the number of lobbyists. Liz, if you want to unmute and share that information you posted about the number of lobbyists for education.
Well, because Matt got me thinking about that. And there are certainly plenty of lobbyists there, and they're spending tons of money lobbying. But what's the result? We're not getting very many federal dollars going to education. And yet you started, Olivia, with all the money that is going to buy planes and trains and warships and so on. So something's going on besides just the sheer number of lobbyists and the sheer amount of money. For some reason, Washington is listening more to those big companies than they are to the education lobbyists, even though the education lobbyists are spending plenty of money. I don't have an answer, just facts for you here.
And I think it's sort of looking at the trends too. When you look at 20 years of trends, you can see that that's happening. But Dan, we want to add to the conversation.
I just wanted to jump in, picking up on what Laura and I think Will also said. You know, labor unions do supply campaign cash, but they are massively outspent by corporate interests. The figure that sticks in my mind from the 2016 federal elections, where $7 billion, well, that's inflation adjusted 2020 money, but $7 billion spent. I think about 220 billion of that came from all labor unions, of which the National Education Association was one of them. So they're not insignificant, but it is important to recognize that the campaign funding power of wealthy individuals and corporations is vastly greater than that of any other kind of group, than labor unions or for that matter, even environmental groups and other groups that lobby.
All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and there are a few questions still in the chat, but I'm going to let Amy ask her question right now, and then I'll jump to some of the questions in the chat.
Great, thanks, Will. You know, I wanted to follow up sort of from Kurt's comments that this issue, how much of our resources go into the military industrial complex affects everything else. And yet, you know, that doesn't seem to be recognized. We tend to find that other groups, other issues, they don't see peace as central to, you know, to what they're doing. And I wondered, Olivia, as an organizer. What are your thoughts around how to shift that? Do you have any ideas for action and communication and ways we can, talk with people that help them make this connection that we see as very clear? And maybe Kurt has an idea too. I saw his hand to go up. I don't know, but I'll pass it back to Olivia.
But I think as organizers, you have to have a narrative and a message, and you have to have message discipline. And I think that when we talk about what are those core narratives that are that to shift, and I think we need to make the connections between money and politics and peace issues. I mean, I think that it's very clear that we need to elevate democracy in the conversation, because I don't think we're going to see any movement towards peace until we see more movement towards fair campaign finance and lobbying reform. I think that those, and I think that our movements need to think about what are those strategies together collectively. And I'm just going to point you to Rethink Media, because Rethink Media is working on democracy and peace issues, and they have some excellent trainings, spokesperson trainings, message narratives, and I would point you to Rethink Media, because I think that they have some ideas already and some good resources for activists and organizers on what are core messages, and some good sample social media, not only like how to use social media as an organizer, but also some samples that are really helpful. So that might be a good resource to go to. But Kurt was who originally brought that up. So Kurt, would you want to add to Amy's thoughts there?
I would say run for office, challenge Democratic politicians who are part of the corporate establishment on every level. I'm disappointed that we have not had more, I will call them Bernie Sanders style primary challenges to people like Maggie Hassan, Jean Shaheen, who was, that seat, by the way, is up in 4 years. They'll have a presidential cycle, then the Shaheen seat is up if she runs again, or whoever runs. We should have a candidate for that seat that is running on principles of universal health care and trimming the sales of the military industrial complex, and asking the questions as to why the Democratic Party has failed in their mission to protect women's health care, and et cetera, and challenge them, because what they've been is a fundraising machine that have not delivered on the things that personally I have wanted from them. And I believe that when they're challenged on these, we make progress. They'll tell us that we're going to elect Republicans, and we need to say, let the chips fall where they may. That's my message tonight. Thanks.
I think that feeds in a little bit to something that I saw that caught my attention. There are a bunch. We're not going to make it to all of the questions, but we did have a question from I think it's Pat Fontes that really, to me, shows a kind of a desperate frustration with democracy in the U.S. And I think when we see the reality that you can't be taken seriously for public office unless you can raise enough money to be taken seriously, we see that only a certain type of candidates tend to make it, as Kurt's alluding to. So Pat Fontes from Rhode Island, I think you're being too loose in your examples of democracy is voting, the example of women's franchisement. The real issue is, what power do the votes have? Does the legislation match public opinion? Is the general public better off? What do you say to people who are just fed up with American democracy and think that it's failed?
Thank you for that question. And I think that many of us feel a little bit like, why does my vote matter? And I think that's a sentiment that's shared with, 40 to 50% of the electorate that don't show up in a given election, the people who are not showing up on regular elections, and more people don't show up for municipal elections. than they do for federal elections. So federal presidential elections, the most people show up, but you see that number drop. And many of the people who are not showing up for election are just saying my vote doesn't matter, my power doesn't matter. And I think that it's really important that many of those individuals begin to have faith in the system and at least participate at the polls. But I also think that there are really important public policy solutions like democracy dollars that would give every voter four $25 certificates to give to politicians of their choice so that they can be the campaign donors and they don't have to rely on billionaires to be funding our elections. Solutions like that can restore faith and confidence. But to Pat's point too, there's also gerrymandered districts. Like people don't feel like their vote matters because the politicians have drawn the lines for them. So I think there's a lot to unpack in that question. Others who have thoughts on,
we don't really have time for too much else. We've
not
got 3
answering
minutes
it.
left. I do want to, there's one last, and there's a lot of really good chat, both questions that we didn't get to and comments in the chat, and I'll ask Doreen if she can send that out to folks with the PowerPoint tomorrow. But I do want to just, there's one question that I think is a good one to close with. It's another one from Chris Hansen. And Chris says, Olivia, what keeps you hopeful?
What keeps me hopeful? Well, let's end on that one. But I also want to touch on Betsy Kelly's question about, civics and how we can increase civics in this country, because I think there's some solutions to bring more civic knowledge to both our elementary school. Some work that we're doing around high school voter registration drives, organize one in your local high school, Betsy. We also need to start thinking about those items that give us hope. I was so hopeful that the Congress a year ago was going to pass the biggest, boldest democracy reform ever in history. We got 2 votes shy of passing the most historic democracy reform. And I'm hopeful we can do it again. I'm hopeful that environmental groups, citizen action groups, other groups can come together and build a movement to pass historic reforms. We have seen historic changes before that rise from citizen power, collective citizen power. Some of you might remember them from the 60s. And we saw then the rise of the military industrial complex and also concentrated wealth and power, buying and wielding influence. So I am hopeful because people can raise their voices. Collectively, we can create change. Collectively, Granny D walked across this country 3,200 miles. I read her words from 20 years ago. They still ring true today. That inspires me to keep fighting, keep walking for reform, because we need to be optimistic that collectively we can build citizen action. And Chris, I know you've been standing on a street corner in Keene for years. And I know you keep going and standing on the street corner. So I know you have hope in your heart that other people are seeing your signs and that you are making a difference by standing at Central Square in Keene. So I want us to encourage others to keep their activism high, and that the art of activism is something that we continue to do and get better at every year, and that we need to continue to practice that, build skills, build movements, and collectively build people power in order to create the change we hope to see.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was a great ending right at 8 o'clock. Everybody, we will continue to have this conversation series every other week, and it will continue to be free and open to the public. But if you feel inspired, we do subsist on your donations, as does Open Democracy, who shares the 3rd floor of 4 Park Street with us. So check us out, nhpeaceaction.org or opendemocracy.org. It's just opendemocracy.org, right?
OpenDemocracy.org.
nh.org, sorry. Open Democracy NH or nhpeaceaction.org. Check us out. Get involved. Join us 2 weeks from now. So you can join us next Tuesday. Next Tuesday we'll have Libby Hoffman, who's going to talk about her book, The Answers Are There, about peacemaking in Sierra Leone. 2 weeks after that, April 24th, we're going to have, that's 2 weeks from today, April 24th, we'll have Lisa and Emma from 350. They're going to talk about climate and militarism. Arnie asked in the chat what we've got going on for tax day. You can meet us at 10 a.m. at the Bridge Street Cafe in Manchester. We've got flyers printed, and we will be visiting all 4 of our congressional delegations' offices that day to give them some information about what our federal budget priorities are. So thank you everybody for joining, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the